Hello and welcome back to Vintage Treasures. Today I'm going to be talking about cheaper lines or lines that you should start with if you're thinking about going into vintage collecting. Some of these lines might have holy grails, as most lines do, but the bulk of these lines usually are cheap and affordable. So if you want to bulken up your collection, or if you want to start collecting vintage toys in general, I think these are some great first steps you should take into the vintage collecting world. So, not necessarily a line, but definitely something that is most likely vintage and is a collection that would look great in a vintage collection and is cheap is McDonald's, because these things were given away, literally given away, in Happy Meals in the 80s, the 90s, or really any decade you want to collect. I think they started selling Happy Meals in the 70s, in the early 70s. I could be wrong. Uh, I don't know the exact year, but there's plenty of McDonald's merchandise out there. I focus mostly on McDonald's land, which is going to be around the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s, which I think is very common. That's like a lot of collectors collect McDonald's land if they collect McDonald's. And yeah, there's Holy Grails, but you don't have to buy those necessarily. Uh, the McDonald's toys work well on display, or they have VHSs, they have the dolls that you could buy in stores in the 70s, which are a bit expensive, maybe not something to start with, but these you can pick up fairly cheap on Instagram or on eBay or at garage sales since they were given away. Uh, they don't have too much functionality usually, but they are great display pieces. Now, I know that Turtles has a reputation for being expensive in the collector's community, but there is a good number of figures that are quite inexpensive, and even like boxed figures that are inexpensive. Usually the main four you can get pretty cheap in rough condition. I'll be fair on that one, but you will have them. Also, there's like the original, the original. There's the original set of them from '88. I mean, not the original set, but like those figures being Bebop, Rocksteady, the Foot Soldier, Shredder, Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo, Raphael, April, and Splinter. But definitely not the '88 ones because those are soft heads and those are desirable. I mean, they're not too expensive, but if you're a starter collector, you definitely want to stick to these hardhead ones. They're really common. They sold them throughout the whole sales of the line, which is '88 to '97. So 9 years, almost 10 years, these were sold. So they're quite common. So they're quite cheap. There's also the Mutations line, which I almost have two sets of the Turtles. So I have one set up as the Turtles, one set up as the Ninja Turtles. And those are the ones that are typically pretty cheap when they're still in the box. They're around 40 bucks, which it's a lot, but it's vintage and it has the box. So, yeah, that's pretty sick. I don't have any personally, but that's like a starter grail, I guess, something to put on the shelf and, get someone's attention that's looking at your collection. So maybe you don't want to collect turtles because they're not your thing, or maybe you just want to stay contained to a smaller line that is still vintage, uh, but you don't want to break the bank. And that's when Stone Protectors come in. These are quite inexpensive toys. There's not a whole lot. I think there was 2 or 3 waves of figures and 2 vehicles, I believe. The boxed vehicles, you can get both of them for about 50 bucks, which is dirt cheap on the collector's market. That might skyrocket soon. And if it did, well, you heard it here first. But yeah, definitely a line. It's great to collect. I did pick up a $40 lot of them actually. I'll put that video as like the. I'll put the video at the end so you can watch it through after you watch this video. I got them for $5, $5 each, so they're relatively cheap. Buying them in lots, of course, you'll get them cheaper. There's not a whole lot of figures in the line, so yeah, a nice contained line with some vehicles and great Great paint, great sculpting, and even a gimmick. The gimmick's typically not even broken in these figures. They do break sometimes though, so do keep an eye out for that. But if you're interested in turtles, but want to spend even less money, then Stone Protectors is probably the way to go. Now, another line created by Playmates in the early 90s was Dick Tracy, based on the movie. The movie did horrible. Personally, I've never watched the movie, but it doesn't look too bad. The figures themselves are relatively cheap. This is the only figure I have carded. It's the only figure I have, and it happens to be carded. But, yeah, the figures are pretty cheap. The accessories can be a bit pricey. I did forget to mention that the Stone Protectors accessories are dirt cheap as of right now. But the figures themselves, they're molded good. They look great on display. They display well. There is vehicles in the line. Now those can get a bit pricey, but the figures themselves are pretty cheap. I picked this guy up for $15 at a thrift mall or something along those lines, like an antique store. I picked him up for 15 bucks, so that's how cheap this line is. Yeah, so definitely keep an eye out for these figures. They're made by Disney, and this is all of the figures that were included in the line. And of course, that elusive figure, the scratch of the series, is the blank. I don't have her, obviously, but yeah, definitely pick up that figure if you ever see him. Yep, this figure is pretty cool. They display easily, they display well, they're cheap, so if you're a beginning collector, I think they're the perfect market for you to start in. Now, this isn't technically a line, but I include it in the video still because I think it is very crucial to beginning collectors. I definitely picked up a lot of this stuff in the beginning of my collection adventure, I guess, and some of it stuck around, but you can definitely sell it. There is a resale market. Sometimes they're not worth as much, but they usually hold the price pretty well, especially if you keep them new. And that is reproduction or reimagined or uh, themed merchandise. So what I mean by all of that is these are lines that are based around a vintage line. They are recreations of a vintage figure, something like that. Not necessarily stuff like NECA, where they're like price hiked collectible items, but something like the Masters of the Universe, the remakes they have. They're pretty cheap. They're pretty cheap. I think they're about 20 bucks for the deluxe sets, and about 15 for the regular figures. So pretty cheap. They're nice. They hold up pretty well in the collection. The adhesive's good on them, which I think is very important. And then there's themed merchandise, like this is themed around the original 88 run of the Turtles, as seen in the art. It's not exactly spot on, but again, you don't have to keep these forever. But if you are interested in them, then pick them up, and you can eventually sell them. Even if you don't make all your money back, you still will be able to get something for them because they are collector's items. So if you found this video useful, then give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy content based around toys and other stuff like that from the 80s, 90s, and sometimes the 70s. I do buy reproductions, but I usually don't show them off on the channel. So mostly original toys. I do haul videos. I do stuff like that, and I plan on going out and actually showing you footage of me finding this stuff out in the wild at yard sales. So if you're interested, subscribe to the channel, and have a great rest of your day or night. Goodbye.